The emergency session opened under a ceiling of cold stars rendered in living glass, each point of light mapped to a member polity, each polity pretending the chamber was still a place of law rather than leverage. The Nexari delegation arrived last and moved first. Their procession crossed the obsidian floor without escort, 6 pale-robed psychics flanking High Commander Ray, while attendant drones projected legal packets into every translation stream before the presiding bell had finished resonating. The title on those packets was not subtle: Administrative Reassignment of the Loamward Belt to Nexari Stewardship Authority. No petition. No debate request. Reassignment. Ray stood at the central rostrum as if he already owned it, his cranial diadem humming at frequencies half the chamber could feel in their teeth. Nexari influence had always moved on that edge between politics and compulsion, and most delegations had learned to tolerate the sensation the way old sailors tolerated storms. Human delegates, who lacked any psychic receptor architecture worth naming, simply blinked and waited. Their stillness irritated him. He began with a voice shaped for command theaters and surrender halls. Esteemed Council, the Loamward Belt remains critically mismanaged under Terran administration. Output variability has exceeded strategic tolerances for 12 cycles, distribution priorities have been distorted by local voting blocks, and infrastructure security protocols are inadequate for frontier scarcity events. The Nexari oligarchic boards have therefore executed a corrective stewardship action. Transition contracts are already drafted, migration schedules are prepared, and compliance metrics are achievable within 1 standard quarter. We are not discussing conquest. We are discussing competent governance. A ripple of coded objections moved through the chamber. Ray raised one hand and pressed on, eyes fixed on the human gallery. Humanity mistakes persistence for sophistication. You endure. That is biologically interesting. You produce at volume. That is economically useful. But you remain strategically primitive. A non-psychic species cannot be centrally harmonized at interstellar scale. You call your process democracy. We observe only noise. A parliament of deaf minds, each faction shouting at weather, grain prices, and ancestral myths, while supply chains drift toward collapse. Several delegations registered formal protest at the language. He did not acknowledge them. The populations currently occupying Loamward holdings will be retrained, relocated, and made productive under proper thought architecture. This will be bloodless, efficient, and beneficial to regional stability. We have no interest in extermination. We have every interest in ending agrarian irrationality. The words bloodless and beneficial carried the same tone one might use to discuss equipment maintenance. Across the chamber, the Valari envoy folded all 4 hands in a grief gesture old enough to predate the council itself. The Kith observer clicked his beak in disbelief and asked for the floor. Denied. Ray signaled again, and the chamber lights dimmed as his tactical overlays replaced the star ceiling with maps of the Loamward Belt. Crescent worlds, ring habitats, moon chain terraces, water towers, grain vaults, export gates. Gold and green sectors pulsed beneath Nexari annotation tags. Stewardship node, compliance district, transitional labor quarter. Not a single map label retained a human place name. Your records, Ray said, frame this belt as a cultural frontier. We frame it as food geometry. Inputs, outputs, transit vectors, labor optimization. Emotional attachment to soil is not governance. Ritual festivals are not logistics doctrine. Family title claims are not strategic rights. Humanity had provisional custody. That period is complete. Council Secretary Mellon of the Crystalline Consortium interrupted with the procedural precision of someone trying to stop a landslide with etiquette. High Commander Ray, the Council Charter forbids unilateral annexation of registered civic zones without arbitration and resident consent. Ray turned toward the crystalline dais with patient contempt. The Charter also obligates intervention when incompetent stewardship threatens multi-species stability. We are intervening. If Terrans wish to contest, they may file appeals while transition teams secure assets. Administrative realities need not await sentimental process. He let the word sentimental linger, then aimed it like a blade. Humans cultivate a mythology around hardship. They confuse calluses with authority. They celebrate improvisation because planning disciplines elude them. The belt does not need folklore. It needs coherent command. We will provide it. By the third hour of emergency debate, the chamber had split into familiar camps. Frightened neutrals, silent opportunists, and a minority of states willing to say openly that the Nexari had crossed a line no charter language could soften. The human delegation remained almost unnervingly contained. No shouting, no procedural theatrics, no walkout. They listened, requested full transmission logs, and asked that Ray restate his relocation language on record. He did, gladly. He wanted witnesses. When the presiding bell called recess, Nexari aides distributed implementation timetables as if the vote had already been cast. The first line item was blunt. Phase 1 pacification. Loamward outer moons. Immediate activation pending command authorization. Ray signed the authorization on the chamber floor where everyone could see it. In the diplomatic corridor beyond the hall, where ambient fields dropped low enough for species with fragile cognition to think clearly, he was intercepted by a cluster of minor attachés and one very old scholar from Lum. The scholar asked why he was forcing a crisis over farms when trade alternatives existed. Ray smiled without warmth. Because force settles arguments faster than hunger. Then he continued down the corridor while his aides discussed transport lanes for rural population movement in the same practical tones used for shipping fertilizer. The human mission suite occupied a narrow crescent wing overlooking the council's docking spines. No ceremonial guard stood outside, only 2 logistics officers in plain slate uniforms and a maintenance cart loaded with sealed hard cases. Inside, Ambassador Sarah Hayes removed her translator pin, set it beside a stack of printed land registries, and watched the replay feed in silence until Ray's final sentence ended. Across the table sat Colonel Elena Markovich, Terran Colonial Defense, shoulders squared, expression composed in that specific way professionals used when anger had been indexed and stored for later use. He gave us his legal theory, his operations timeline, and his confidence profile in one speech, Markovich said. Efficient of him. Hayes exhaled once. He also gave us what we need for unanimous domestic authorization. There will be no ambiguity about intent. A third figure, Commander James Sullivan of Belt Civil Logistics, appeared as a secure hollow in farmware and reserve insignia, standing in what looked like a machine shed converted into a command post. Behind him, racks of field tablets shared wall space with seed catalogs and a framed family map annotated in grease pencil. We've had 6 hours of anomalous Nexari traffic near Harrow and Wren, Sullivan reported. Not raiders. Survey packets and suppression signatures. They are building seizure geometry, not blockade posture. Hayes slid one registry forward. How fast can you harden local networks if they attempt psionic disruption? Sullivan glanced off screen, receiving numbers from someone nearby. Initial blackout protocol in 40 minutes. Full analog relay conversion in 4 hours across primary valleys, 10 across secondary terraces. We trained for worse. Markovich studied him. Civilian compliance risk? His answer came flat and certain. Minimal. They know their status. Status meant registered homestead sovereignty, a legal framework most of the council mocked as quaint until they needed Terran grain. Each farm plot in the Loamward Belt was both livelihood and chartered civic unit, tied to emergency defense obligations that had never been tested at full scale. Farmers filed soil reports, yes. They also maintained hardened relay kits, local shelter plans, and reserve muster codes, because frontier law had been written by people who remembered supply collapse with painful detail. Hayes activated a second feed. Governor Ingrid Larson of Harrow 9, sleeves rolled, standing in a weather station as storm data scrolled behind her like falling rain. We just received Nexari transition notices addressed to temporary occupants, Larson said. My office has replied with trespass penalties, seizure denial, and notification that all water rights towers are under protected status. Markovich almost smiled. How did they take that? Larson checked a side screen. They sent back a template about cognitive hierarchy and resource stewardship. Very polished, also inaccurate. Sullivan's mouth twitched in a brief shard of gallows humor. Good to know we are being conquered by administrators with excellent formatting. No one laughed for long. The stakes were too clear. Hayes stood and paced once to the viewport, where freighters from half the galaxy drifted in docking queues that depended, quietly and absolutely, on Loamward harvest projections. Trade before guns had been human doctrine for 2 centuries, not because humans feared war, but because they understood arithmetic. Feed worlds first, and fewer empires reached for fleets. The doctrine had worked until it met an oligarchy convinced that non-psychic restraint meant incapacity. She turned back to the room and spoke in the same measured cadence she had used in chamber hearings, court depositions, and casualty briefings. Ray believes coordination requires a single mind to dominate many minds. That is his blind spot. Ours has always been distributed obligation. Family, district, cooperative, reserve, convoy, planet, species. Different layers, same commitment. He sees farms. We see infrastructure, memory, and people who keep promises. Markovich nodded once. Then we prepare visibly and quietly. No panic broadcasts. No dramatic mobilization around core shipyards. He expects that pattern. Sullivan leaned toward the hollow pickup. He will hit the breadbasket first. Yes, Hayes said, and he will think that means we have already lost. Outside the mission suite, council aides whispered that humanity had been cornered by a superior power. Inside, Terran officers reviewed relay maps, homestead charters, and contingency tables older than the current border disputes. They logged every Nexari declaration for tribunal use, synchronized emergency channels with allied observers, and sent one short advisory to every Loamward District Council. Hold your ground. Convert to resilient systems. Further instruction follows. On Harrow 9, evenings settled over terraces, cut by generations of patient hands, and porch lights began blinking in a pattern that looked domestic to strangers and operational to anyone trained to read it. In valleys the Nexari databases classified as low-threat agricultural zones, reservists checked mesh shielding beside seed vaults, municipal clerks unlocked sealed defense binders, and irrigation walls listed as heritage masonry were quietly reclassified as hardened positions under emergency statute. When the first Nexari pacification flotillas crossed into belt space, they carried contracts, suppression arrays, and confidence. Waiting for them were people who had spent lifetimes learning that survival favored those who prepared without spectacle and stayed where they were planted. The Nexari lead transport broke the belt boundary with ceremonial lighting active, violet wake spilling across sensor screens as if this were a treaty parade instead of an armed seizure. Behind it came 3 suppression carriers, 2 custody barges, and a lattice of escort cutters packed with compliance cadres in matte black armor. Their first transmission did not request docking rights. It opened with legal citation, moved directly to relocation quotas, and closed with a deadline. All non-essential human populations were to vacate designated stewardship zones within 6 local hours. On Harrow 9, Governor Ingrid Larson listened to the order in the weather station operations room, one palm resting on the steel table where river flow maps were still pinned under mugs and old calibration weights. Colonel Elena Markovich stood beside her, helmet under one arm, while Ambassador Sarah Hayes appeared on a secure wall feed from the council complex, her face lit by static from a hard-line channel that ignored half the station's compromised networking stack. Nexari text rolled in translation across the lower screen. Temporary occupants. Transitional labor assignment. Mandatory cognitive realignment. Larson read the lines once, then muted the audio and said, "They did not even bother changing the template." "They did not need to," Markovich answered. "They think template language wins wars." Hayes leaned forward in the feed. "Open a full-spectrum reply. Public bands and military bands together. I want every delegation that still pretends neutrality to hear this in one recording." The station techs switched routing by hand. Fiber relays buried in route corridors took over as the first suppression wave brushed the moon and the room lights dimmed for a second before backup inverters steadied. Somewhere below the station ridge, warning sirens remained silent by design. Loamward Doctrine preferred clear instructions to alarm. Hayes spoke without raising her voice, each sentence precise enough to survive hostile editing. "High Commander Ray, Nexari Command, and all attached officers. This is Ambassador Sarah Hayes of the Terran delegation. Your entry into registered homestead jurisdictions constitutes armed trespass. Every surveyed farm plot, water tower, and cooperative exchange listed in Loamward civil records is sovereign ground under charter law. Forced seizure will be treated as an existential attack on humanity. For 2 centuries, we traded grain before guns and patience before pride. Choose trade again. Withdraw your pacification assets immediately and submit dispute claims to arbitration." The transmission went out in 12 languages and 3 machine logics. 30 seconds later, Ray answered from his flagship, seated beneath the humming ring of his diadem, expression composed in the way only the truly certain managed. "Ambassador Hayes, your species continues to confuse emotional attachment with legal leverage. You invoke sovereignty over fields you cannot defend and rights you cannot enforce against superior cognition. This is not war, despite your theatrical cadence. This is correction. Relocation will proceed. Municipal structures that cooperate will be retained under Nexari supervision. Those that resist will be decertified and reassigned. You may preserve lives by instructing your populations to comply now, or you may preserve pride and lose both infrastructure and relevance. Warning requires leverage. You have none." He cut the channel before protocol allowed rebuttal. In the weather station, no one moved for a breath. Then, Larson reached for the station key, turned it clockwise, and authorized Emergency Statute 7, converting all civil districts to protected civic military posture. Across the moon, clerks in grain exchanges received the same code and unlocked seal boxes they had never expected to use outside exercises. Markovich activated her command slate. "Terran colonial defense to all Loamward Outer Moon Councils. Rule remains unchanged. Hold your ground. Disable vulnerable smart systems. Shift to hardened local relays. Do not mass in towns. Defend your plots under charter authority." Her channel filled with acknowledgments from places that sounded more like weather reports than battle stations. "North Terrace Cooperative. Understood. Kettle Basin Irrigation Board. Understood. Crown Ridge Seed Bank. Understood." Commander James Sullivan appeared as a hard-edged hollow from his machine shed command post, reserve insignia clipped over faded farm canvas. He had grease on one cuff and a tactical overlay in his eyes. "Outer Moon Line is converting now," he said. Suppression pressure is rising on municipal nets. We will lose centralized cloud coordination in minutes. Then we stopped pretending we needed it, Markovich said. Sullivan nodded once, receiving the intent before she finished. Hearthline protocol? Hearthline protocol, she confirmed. Broadcast only by local relays from this point. Keep strategic channels dark unless essential. Hayes watched both of them through the static and gave the order the Council would parse for decades. Terran Command recognizes Nexari action as active invasion. Defensive response is authorized under Charter and Species Law. Record all contacts for tribunal chain. The room became motion. Techs yanked optic jumpers, rerouted power manually, and killed every automation layer the Nexari were most likely to map first. In valleys below, porch lights blinked in coated clusters, while families carried sealed cases from pantry floors and tool sheds to pre-marked positions behind irrigation stonework that had stood for generations. By local midnight, the first Nexari landing burn scarred the upper atmosphere over Harrow 9, and human districts that had spent years being dismissed as rustic inefficiency shifted into war footing without a single central broadcast. Ray watched the descent from orbit and felt only mild impatience. His planning models projected 92% compliance after initial display operations. The remaining percentage was statistically irrelevant, a residue of stubbornness to be managed by targeted compulsion and selective property seizure. He had fought fleet admirals and palace coalitions. He was not going to be delayed by orchard associations. Begin Phase 1 pacification, he told Prime Executor Sal. Suppress command coherence. Seize water rights nodes, then transport hubs. Avoid unnecessary casualties. We need labor continuity. Sal inclined his head. And resistance clusters? Ray's eyes stayed on the tactical display where farmland rendered as clean geometry. Demonstrate inevitability. Once they understand there is no coordinating authority left to obey, resistance behavior will collapse. Suppression arrays unfolded from carrier hulls like metallic petals and released a broad-spectrum psychic haze tuned to fracture synchronized decision-making in non-shielded populations. Across Harrow 9, municipal dashboards stuttered, long-range civilian networks spat error cascades, and dozens of town administrators felt a sudden pressure behind the eyes that made thought feel crowded and brittle. In the district office at Wren Crossing, two clerks sat down hard on archive steps as the signal hit. Outside, a notice beacon on the civic pole switched from green to amber, then died entirely. Nexari compliance teams entered 3 minutes later, planted seizure markers on the registry desk, and announced transition authority to a room full of shaking staff. No shots, no riots, exactly as projected. Then the projected pattern began to fray. At North Terrace, expected evacuation traffic never formed. Farm trucks stayed parked behind stone walls. Families did not flee toward urban shelters. They shut gates, cut their own smart grids, and raised narrow signal masts from barn roofs by hand crank. In Kettle Basin, a Nexari squad tagged a water tower for asset transfer, turned to secure the adjacent relay shed, and found its core routers physically removed and replaced by dead steel plates. In Crown Ridge, suppression teams jammed municipal comms successfully, then detected persistent low-band coordination continuing anyway through point-to-point line of sight bursts the models had flagged as obsolete. Executor Sal frowned at the incoming anomalies. We're seeing residual coordination in rural sectors despite broad-spectrum interference. Ray dismissed the first cluster with a gesture. Local inertia. It will burn out. It did not burn out. It multiplied. On the ground, Nexari armored carriers rolled down access roads between terraces bright with late-season grain. Helmet optics painted homestead markers over every gate, each tagged in human legal code with owner names and charter dates. Compliance officers found this almost touching, like children engraving property lines in sand before tide change. At Terrace Delta 3, Captain Vesk of the security cadres deployed 2 squads to secure a line of low stone walls listed in his database as heritage irrigation structures with no tactical significance. His troops advanced in textbook wedges, rifles low, shield emitters up. He expected verbal protest, maybe sporadic tool weapon fire from frightened civilians. What met them was silence. Then, synchronized impact strikes on their forward shields from concealed positions so well ranged that 3 emitters overloaded at once. Not heavy weapons. Precision volley fire from converted agricultural launchers firing dense ceramic slugs at exact junction angles. "Forward, break them," Vesk ordered, irritated. His left flank stepped into a drainage corridor and triggered magnetic caltrops deployed under fresh soil. Boots locked, servos whined, formation fractured. Overhead, what his tactical board identified as pollination drones rose from orchard rows in dense swarms and painted his optics with reflective chaff, reducing visibility to a strobing blur. None of it was decisive by itself. Together, it was professionally annoying, the kind of layered nuisance designed by people who understood equipment and patience. Vesk keyed command. Resistance equipped above estimate. Request heavier pacification package. No answer for 4 seconds. Then, static. Then, a clipped relay from a neighboring unit reporting similar contact and failed synchronization with district command. In orbit, Sal's composure thinned. Outer Moon command mesh is fragmenting. Suppression remains active, but they are routing around it with local hardlines and visual relays. We are forcing down 1 network and they are spawning 5 smaller ones. Ray stared at the map as orange Nixari control zones advanced less smoothly than predicted. Human signatures moved in dispersed clusters, refusing the decisive mass he wanted. They were not contesting cities. They were contesting lanes, towers, culverts, ridgelines, seed depots, and crossroads where 2 dirt tracks met and mattered. It looked less like a military front than 1,000 deliberate interruptions. He switched to direct theater broadcast, pushing his voice through every open channel in the occupied districts. Human occupants of Loamward sectors hear Nixari command. Further resistance is irrational and will be recorded as criminal obstruction of stabilization policy. You are agriculturists, not soldiers. You are physically durable but organizationally deficient at strategic scale. Lay down improvised weapons, return to habitation zones, and accept relocation processing. Continued defiance will not alter outcomes. It will only increase your losses while delaying the structure that will ultimately feed this region responsibly. The speech bought him nothing except new recordings for future tribunals. On Harrow 9, Markovich listened from a bunker carved under an old seed cooperative, then muted the feed and looked at Sullivan's projection. Behind him, volunteers in farm coveralls and reserve harnesses moved ammunition cases labeled as soil nutrient cartridges. "He still thinks a speech can collapse us," Sullivan said. "He believes hierarchy is physics," Markovich replied. "He cannot imagine trust functioning sideways." A junior signal officer handed her a printed strip from a hand crank receiver. She scanned it, then passed it to Larson. Nixari reserve elements committing at Harrow Transit Spine. Seizure beacons confirmed on wheat terraces. Municipal net loss now total in 6 districts. Local relay net stable. Larson read the line twice, jaw set. "So this is the shape. They cut the head and expect the body to quit." Markovich keyed a closed channel to district captains. "All positions, this is colonial defense. You are authorized for counter-seizure operations under rules of preservation. Prioritize beacons, suppressor nodes, and transport choke points. Keep civilian corridors open. Keep records clean. Acknowledgements came back from barns, depots, and tractor bays, voices calm enough to unsettle anyone expecting panic. By dawn's first gray edge over the terraces, Nexari pacification flags stood on several municipal buildings, and their carriers still held orbital altitude. On every broad metric Ray cared about, Phase 1 looked survivable. Yet his command board now contained a new column he had not requested. Unresolved resistance nodes, multiplying faster than compliance reports. In the bunker, Sullivan expanded a tactical overlay and traced a finger along 3 valleys converging toward Harrow's transit spine. "They think they are pushing us inward," he said quietly. "They are actually entering prepared geometry." Markovich met his eyes. "Can your districts hold long enough?" His answer carried no drama at all. "We built these places to outlast weather, debt cycles, and bad governments. We can hold." Above them, another wave of Nexari landers burned through cloud cover, confident they were tightening control. Below them, farmers who had refused to leave their land finalized firing arcs, relay timings, and fallback lanes that had been hidden in plain sight for years. And Terran Command gave the order to begin the response Ray had insisted they could never coordinate. The order propagated through Loamward like rain through dry terraces, not as one commanding broadcast, but as thousands of local confirmations carried on systems the Nexari doctrine had categorized as obsolete, redundant, and therefore strategically irrelevant. In the bunker beneath the Seed Cooperative, Colonel Elena Markovich watched her main tactical screen split into a quilt of district feeds, each one running on a different pathway. Fiber lines buried in route corridors carried dense packet bursts between neighboring valleys. Hand-crank radios moved fallback codes over low-band channels that suppression haze struggled to hold. Line-of-sight masts on barn roofs flashed tightly timed optical sequences from ridge to ridge. Old signal craft updated with modern error correction and disciplined operators. The first surprise was not a weapon. It was continuity. Nexari suppression air rays had been tuned to fracture centralized coherence by overloading civic dashboards and command cloud architecture. Harrow 9 simply stopped pretending it needed either. Municipal networks went dark by design in 6 districts, then in 9, and then all at once across the outer terraces as local councils executed Hearthline protocol in full. Instead of one nervous command center trying to rebuild a shattered map, the moon became 134 small command cells, each with pre-authorized decision rights, each linked laterally to its neighbors, each capable of continuing if all higher channels vanished. Markovich keyed district command. "All stations preserve rhythm. No heroics. Keep relay intervals strict. We win this by staying legible to each other." Replies came back in clipped local identifiers in plain language. West Culvert, rhythm green. Delta Granary, rhythm green. Crown Ridge East Wall, rhythm green. At North Terrace, 3 families rotated the crank generators beside a relay mast, while 2 reservists in orchard coveralls recalibrated an antenna from a ladder that had hung in the same shed for 40 years. In Kettle Basin, a retired schoolteacher ran traffic deconfliction for 2 militia platoons and 1 evacuation corridor from the office, where she had once scheduled harvest festivals. In Wren Crossing, municipal clerks who had spent the night trembling under suppression pressure now sorted targeting logs by hand because paper did not care about psychic noise. Commander James Sullivan stood in his machine shed post with a grease pencil behind one ear, routing priorities across a wall map that mixed tactical grids with irrigation schedules. He received 3 district pings at once, listened, and answered without changing tone. Do not chase their carriers into open lanes. Break their sensors, then break contact. Node 15. You are covering food convoys, not hunting trophies. Crown Ridge, Report beacon coordinates again and keep them in tribunal format. A younger officer beside him stared at the incoming network traces, then looked up as if he had discovered a new law of physics. Sir, they have cut every trunk line twice. We are still coordinating cleaner than yesterday's drills. Sullivan gave a brief, tired grin. That is because drills assume people panic. Harvest season teaches better habits. In orbit, Prime Executor Saul did not grin. He stood over a cascading wall of data where suppression efficacy remained nominal while human synchronization errors kept dropping instead of rising. The contradiction made no doctrinal sense. He requested a deeper model run. It returned 3 possible explanations, each marked low confidence. Hidden military network, external allied command support, sensor corruption. None fit the ground footage of families turning cranksets, flashing mast codes, and moving with a precision that looked domestic until one tracked its outcomes. "Hi, Commander," Sal said, voice clipped thin. "Their coordination persistence is increasing under full interference. They are not restoring central control. They are bypassing the concept of central control." Ray remained seated at the command dais, fingers steepled, expression disciplined by long practice. Then collapsed the bypass channels, target relay masts, and local repeaters. Already underway, they rebuild in minutes, often from neighboring farms with no visible command queue. Ray's gaze hardened on a feed from Terrace Delta 3, where Captain Vesk's units were pinned behind overloaded shields by impacts timed to split their defensive cycle. "You are describing emergent behavior." "I am describing planned behavior we failed to classify." The Nexari room went very quiet. On the ground, the second layer of the surprise unfolded with practical cruelty. Human districts did not contest every meter. They contested timing. Seizure beacons placed on terraces and water rights towers began vanishing in statistically absurd clusters, not because one strike team moved faster than sensors could track, but because dozens of teams moved according to a shared tempo no single disruption could break. A beacon at Kettle Basin went down 19 seconds after one at Wren Crossing. 2 more disappeared along the Harrow transit spine in the next minute. Then, 6 along a secondary lane that had never appeared in Nexari priority models because it was logged as farm service access. It was not glamorous combat. It was maintenance warfare conducted by people who had spent lives fixing systems under pressure. A Nexari cadre breached a relay shed and found no core hardware, only steel decoys and a handwritten note in Terran legal code citing trespass penalties. Another squad seized an orchard mast and congratulated itself for 87 seconds before a mirror mast on the opposite ridge inherited traffic and restored the lane. A suppression carrier finally burned out one low-band frequency cluster, then watched 3 valleys shift to light pulses, and courier drones carrying encrypted solid-state capsules in weatherproof cases marked with fertilizer brand logos. By mid-morning local time, Harrow 9 had lost every convenience and kept every function that mattered. Ambassador Sarah Hayes, still at the council complex, listened to the same battlefield rhythm through hardened channels and began forwarding authenticated clips to delegations that had voted for administrative transition. She chose footage with no dramatic soundtrack and no selective edits. Old women turning cranksets, municipal teens in reserve vests indexing beacon coordinates, a grain truck convoy rerouted through a drainage tunnel while a firefight crackled in distant terraces. Then, she sent one line beneath each packet. This is what strategic irrelevance looks like when it refuses relocation. The Valerie envoy answered first with immediate support for emergency observers. The scholars of LUM requested full access to legal archives and offered neutral verification teams. 2 states that had applauded Ray's announcement asked, in careful language, whether Nexari actions remained proportionate. Hayes did not answer them immediately. She was recording every hesitation for later treaty work. At Harrow Transit Spine, Captain Vesk attempted to regain initiative by ordering a concentrated push toward the central water rights tower, believing the symbolic seizure would fracture district morale. The tower sat on a low rise above split terraces, its white hull marked with generation plaques and maintenance dates. Nexari armor advanced in layered formation, suppressor pods humming. They were met by silence for 20 meters. Then a cross-grid of fire that struck not center mass, but sensors, joints, and emitter rims in exact sequence. Human teams did not overcommit. They fired, relocated through culverts and root-wrapped trenches, and reappeared where predictive paths did not expect them. Vesk hit command again. Request synchronized support from Eastern cadres. I need pressure on both flanks now. No flank support came. The Eastern cadres were fighting their own engagements and receiving their own contradictory orders from an orbital net trying to impose hierarchy on a battlefield that kept dividing itself into local truths. In the bunker, Larson studied the live map and spoke almost softly. They keep trying to take the tallest tower first because that is what empires do when they think politics is a stage. Markovich did not look away from the feeds. Then, we keep teaching them what infrastructure actually is. Sullivan patched in from his shed, jaw shadowed, eyes bright with fatigue and focus. Colonel, we have confirmation from 3 moons. Same pattern. They collapse civic clouds, we switch to route line and mast line. They seize one node, we route around. They are treating each district like a province. It is not a province. It is a mesh. Markovich keyed a broad tactical advisory, voice steady enough to settle hands on distant triggers. All Loanward districts maintain distributed command posture. No district waits for top-down permission when charter criteria are met. Neighbor obligations remain active. If your line goes dark, assume your neighbor is fighting and cover their corridor. Keep civilian movement protected. Keep records clean. Keep faith with the map. The acknowledgments came back with that same unnerving calm. Understood, Colonel. Copy, Loanward South. Received, East Harrow. From orbit, Ray listened to fragments of those transmissions as interception teams pieced together human traffic. The content itself was mundane. Corridor status, ammunition counts, water pressure, volunteer rotations. What unsettled him was the absence of panic and the absence of permission-seeking. In Nexari theory, coherent, large-scale action required directed will radiating downward through ranked cognition. Human traffic sounded like peers honoring procedure because they trusted each other to do the same. No central thought pulse. No psychic lattice. Still coherent. Ray rose from his seat and walked to the tactical holosphere, where orange compliance zones had begun to erode around their edges. Bring me district-by-district attrition and capture rates. Sal hesitated. Capture rates are low. We are taking structures, not control. In some sectors, we have held municipal buildings for hours without reducing local resistance capacity. Ray's voice cooled further. Then, municipal buildings are meaningless. Adjust objectives. That admission, spoken aloud on a Nexari command deck, felt like a hinge turning. He expanded the map to include neighboring moons and saw the same signature repeating, small but stubborn. Suppression active. Central nets dead, resistance coordinated anyway. Beacons lost faster than replaced. Cadres requesting synchronization support that arrived late or not at all. His first instinct was contempt for incompetence among sub-commanders. His second was more dangerous. A dawning recognition that the battlefield itself had been designed to punish his assumptions. Sal broke the silence. Hi, Commander. Doctrine states non-psychic populations under broad suppression should fragment into isolated defensive behavior within 1 to 3 engagement cycles. We are beyond that window. If this continues, Phase 1 pacification converts into a sustained counterinsurgency across agricultural terrain. We did not deploy for that. Ray turned, eyes narrowing. Say what you are implying. Sal held his gaze. Our assumption set was wrong. They prepared for this exact interference model. They distributed authority below our decapitation threshold and embedded military utility in civil systems we classified as low value. They are not improvising. They are executing. Several officers looked away, as if the words themselves carried disciplinary risk. Ray chose his response with visible effort. Rage would have satisfied the room and solved nothing. Then we adapt. Reframe theater command around corridor denial and logistics interdiction. Pull isolated cadres into mutually supporting blocks. Increase sensor sweeps for analog relay nodes. Prioritize capture of technical personnel running these networks. He paused, then added the order he had refused 2 hours earlier. Commit reserve suppression specialists to Harrow 9. Sal inclined his head, relief and dread sharing the gesture. Yes, High Commander. On the surface, Captain Vesk finally received regroup coordinates and began withdrawing from the water tower approach under covering fire. His report to orbit was stripped of rhetoric, each line harder than the last. Delta 3 push failed to secure objective. Human resistance demonstrates pre-surveyed firing geometry and persistent inter-district coordination despite suppression. Request doctrinal update. Current pacification templates are generating casualties without convergence. The answer from orbit came with formal Nexari composure and urgent undertone. All units, execute consolidation pattern cache. Cease dispersed seizure attempts. Fall back to designated strong points at transit spine, custody barge perimeters, and water rights hubs. Maintain defensive posture until reserve specialists arrive. This is a tactical reorganization, not retreat. On Harrow 9, human listeners heard the same transmission and exchanged quick looks over cracked comm screens and scoped sights. Markovich allowed herself one breath of grim satisfaction, then cut across her network. Do not get theatrical. They are hurt, not broken. Keep pressure on movement lanes and beacon teams. Let them cluster where we can count them. Sullivan nodded on hollow. Understood. We will keep them uncomfortable. Across the terraces, Nexari formations tightened for the first time since landing, their confidence giving way to caution, their maps redrawn under fire. They had entered Loamward, expecting to pacify scattered farms. By the end of the first day's fighting, they were digging into defensive blocks against a population they had called uncoordinated, waiting for reinforcements while the fields around them kept talking, in light pulses, crank signals, and buried fiber they still could not silence. Colonel Elena Markovich listened to the Nexari consolidation order fade across the intercept channel, then touched 2 fingers to the edge of her console and said, "All districts, execute orchard glass. Confirm weather rigs, drone bays, and culvert locks on my mark. We are moving from interruption to denial." Around Harrow 9, responses came from places still labeled civilian in every council database. North Terrace Weatherboard, ready. Kettle Basin Seating Spine, ready. Crown Ridge Drone Barns, ready. Governor Ingrid Larson glanced up from the municipal map table. You are committing the agricultural stack. Markovich nodded. They came for food infrastructure. They can learn what food infrastructure does when it is offended. In orbit, Prime Executor Sal saw the first anomaly as a trivial meteorology flag. 9 weather-seeding towers that should have remained in seasonal standby began cycling at combat cadence, their aerosol plumes crossing in geometric bands above the transit spine. Then, 12 more towers joined from adjacent valleys. Moisture levels climbed faster than local climate models allowed, while electrostatic charge in the lower atmosphere spiked into ranges that Nexari psychic amplification collars treated as signal noise. Sal ordered a recalibration sweep. The sweep returned 3 words he had begun to hate. Classification uncertain. Expanding. At ground level, Nexari troops dug into their strongpoints, believing they had stabilized the line. Armored carriers blocked access roads. Suppressor pylons hummed near water towers. Compliance cadres erected perimeter mesh and waited for reserve specialists. What they did not expect was movement from above and below at once. From orchard sheds, grain depots, and pollination labs, thousands of small Terran drones launched in controlled waves. Some carried old pesticide tanks repacked with ferromagnetic slurry. Others trailed wire-thin deployment lines and dropped seeded canisters into drainage cuts and abandoned tractor lanes. They were harvest systems by manufacture and mine layers by software patch, running distributed autonomy profiles that needed no central pilot. Captain Vesk watched his sensor board bloom with new contacts and swore under his breath. What are those units carrying? They are not munitions, class. His tactical officer answered after 3 hard seconds. They are marked as agricultural service craft. They are placing shaped charges and magnetic traps in our vehicle corridors. Then, shoot them down. We are trying. Their flight patterns are pollination randomization routines. They have no military regularity to predict. The first Nexari carrier that tried to reposition from the transit spine hit 2 buried charges in sequence. Not enough to destroy the hull, but enough to crater its front suspension and cant the chassis sideways across the lane. The second carrier halted to assist and rolled into a freshly seeded magnetic patch that locked one track and burned out a steering servo. Human teams waiting in ridge culverts marked both vehicles for later strike and withdrew before counterfire arrived. By mid-afternoon, rain began falling in silver slants over Harrow's western terraces, then turned sharply metallic on armor plating as seeded particulates bound to the storm front. The drops carried conductive dust, tailored to cling to exposed Nexari hardware seams. Every flash of atmospheric discharge now found more willing paths through suppression nodes, relay vanes, and amplification rigs that had been designed for clean skies. On Ray's flagship, the psychic operations chief removed his diadem with shaking hands. Interference has crossed tolerance bands. Broad compulsion effects are fragmenting into local echoes. We can push harder, but feedback risk is climbing. Ray stood over the holosphere, jaw rigid. Push! Hi, Commander. This is not reluctance. It is physics. The storm layer is converting the theater into a static furnace. Our own field coherence is degrading. Ray did not answer immediately. The displays around him showed his strong points still intact, yet every attempt to synchronize them produced staggered latency and contradictory telemetry. The humans had not beaten his suppression arrays directly. They had changed the environment until those arrays no longer behaved like the weapons he had brought. On Harrow 9, Sullivan watched weather tracks and drone lanes on a paper map because paper did not flicker when lightning spoke. West Culvert, keep your mine teams behind stone and let the weather do half the work. Delta Granary, release blind swarm package on my tone. From Delta Granary rose a cloud of micro-drones originally built to pollinate greenhouse crops during dust season. They moved like wind-blown seed, dense and erratic, coating Nexari optics with reflective film, then scattering into thermal decoys that made targeting systems chase ghosts across terraces and empty sheds. Human rifle teams fired only when they had clean confirmation. Ammunition discipline remained strict. patience remained stricter. In the bunker, Larson looked at the rolling map and said, almost astonished despite herself, "They are blind at ranges where they expected dominion." Markovich answered without looking up. "They invested in controlling minds. We invested in keeping systems working when control fails." A Nexari emergency channel cracked to life on open band, encrypted wrapper half burned away by storm interference. "Transit spine command to all units, we cannot maintain suppressor harmonics. Repeat, harmonics collapsing under atmospheric load. Request immediate extraction of amplification cadres from exposed positions." Another voice cut in, tighter, younger. "Water Hub 2 lost optics and ground radar. We are firing by acoustic return. Where is reserve support?" No reserve support came. The weather had pushed shuttle operations into hazard thresholds, and human drones had salted every easy approach with traps calibrated to delay rather than obliterate. Delay was enough. Delay multiplied. On the council floor, far from Harrow's mud and lightning, Ambassador Sarah Hayes stood again at the central rostrum and opened a live evidentiary stream. Delegates watched real-time images of Nexari suppression towers sparking under engineered storms, compliance carriers stalled in farm lanes, and human medics treating wounded neighbors beside crates labeled seed stock. Hayes did not shout. Her voice stayed in that military calm register that turned facts into judgment. Several delegations asked whether this is still an administrative correction. You now have your answer. A correction does not deploy custody barges. A correction does not mark residents as temporary occupants on their own registered homesteads. A correction does not call forced relocation bloodless while landing armed cadres in harvest districts. Humanity is defending sovereign civic ground under charter law. We repeat our prior offer to all non-combatants and conscripted labor castes in Nexari service. Safe corridor terms are open now. Leave the combat zone. Live. The Valari envoy rose first in support. Two former Nexari trading partners followed, less from courage than from arithmetic. Ray's campaign had become expensive, visible, and uncertain. Uncertainty eroded loyalty faster than sermons. Back on Harrow 9, human resolve stopped being abstract and became a logistics rhythm that no bombardment had broken. Volunteers rotated from firing lines to water pumps and back. Reserve medics triaged under greenhouse lamps. Machine shops printed replacement drone parts beside stacks of bread rations and spare boot seals. No district asked whether another district had done enough. They assumed duty was reciprocal and acted accordingly. 90 minutes after the first conductive storm peak, Markovich moved from bunker to forward shelter at Ridge 42, stepping through wet gravel and old tractor ruts while shell fire thudded beyond the terraces. Sullivan met her there, helmet clipped, face lined with fatigue. "They keep probing our culverts with small teams," he said, "looking for one decisive breach." "They still believe in decisive breaches," she replied. He gestured toward the valley where water towers stood against the rain, white columns striped with mud and tracer light. "My grandfather used to say land teaches consensus better than parliaments. You can argue with a neighbor all winter, but when flood season comes, you either reinforce the same wall together or lose the same crop together. That habit scales." Markovich allowed herself a thin smile. "Send that to the council after we win. They could use an education." A burst of static on her headset resolved into Larson's voice from Municipal Command. "Colonel, civilian corridor east of Wren is clear again. Also, district clerks request confirmation that seizure marker logs remain tribunal priority." "Confirmed," Markovich said. "Every marker, every order, every casualty entry. We are not only surviving this, we are documenting it." That insistence on records unsettled Nexari officers more than they admitted. Empires preferred clean narratives. Humans kept receipts. At Transit Spine, Strong Point 3, Captain Vesk reviewed his diminishing options while rain hissed across his armor. His units still held hard cover around the custody barge perimeter, but movement between strong points had become punishing. Every road could be trapped. Every open field could hide low-profile launch teams. Every sensor sweep returned clutter from drone chaff and storm charge. He keyed command with forced composure. This theater is no longer pacification. Opposing force demonstrates integrated civil-military doctrine and terrain-locking denial assets. Request authorization for scorched route clearance. Ray answered personally, voice cold enough to frost metal. Denied. We did not come to destroy the belt, we came to acquire. Hold your perimeter. Reserve fleet movement is under review. Vesk absorbed that and understood the subtext. The High Commander had started counting costs in public words. In orbit, Sal moved through casualty and readiness figures that no longer matched the campaign timetable. If we commit reserve fleet elements now, we can retake initiative around Harrow transit spine with concentrated orbital pressure. If we do not, ground attrition will continue and outer moon control may collapse district by district. Ray stared at Harrow's weather map, where storm cells now followed patterns too intentional to call natural. Commitment invites political escalation. Sal met his eyes. We are already in political escalation. The Council is watching us fail in real time. That sentence hung in the command deck like a drawn blade. On the surface, the balance tipped further when Terran teams began coordinated counter-seizures of suppressor pylons. They did not destroy every node. They captured selected units intact, ripped out Nexari control wafers, and rerouted power into localized counter-emission rigs that disrupted nearby psychic channels. One converted pylon at Kettle Basin bought 6 neighboring districts a window of clear cognition. 2 more at North Terrace opened stable comm corridors across valleys Ray had believed functionally mute. Markovich received the update and transmitted a theater-wide directive. All Loamward commands, this is Colonial Defense. Phase Cedar active. Expand capture operations on suppression hardware where feasible. Preserve units for technical exploitation. Do not overextend for symbolic targets. We are taking their tools and shortening their reach. Acknowledgements rolled in, clipped and steady. Crown Ridge, Cedar active. Wren Crossing, Cedar active. Harrow South, Cedar active. By late day, Nexari maps showed shrinking influence bubbles around isolated strongpoints, each one ringed by contested lanes, humans now dominated after dusk. Ray's doctrine had assumed that once central systems failed, local actors would freeze and await instruction. Human districts had done the opposite. They treated every broken link as permission to act within charter bounds, then stitched results sideways into a functioning whole. Sal broke protocol and said what his officers would not. High Commander, they are taking control of the battlefield grammar itself. We are speaking in hierarchy. They are speaking in networks. Our sentences are not reaching the ground. Ray's hands tightened behind his back. Then we end the conversation with force. He turned to the fleet operations pit. Signal Reserve Command. Prepare descent vectors for Harrow 9. I want heavy platforms positioned over transit spine and water hubs before next local dawn. On Ridge 42, Markovich received the intercept 3 minutes later. She read it once, then handed the strip to Sullivan and Larson beneath the shelter's dim tactical light. Sullivan exhaled through his nose. There it is. Larson set her jaw. He finally decided the farmers are worth a fleet. Markovich keyed every district channel, voice level, eyes hard. All commands confirm readiness for major escalation. Reserve Nexari fleet committing to Harrow Theater. Maintain corridor protection, sustain Cedar captures, and lock storm control rotations. We have shifted the line. Now, we hold it against their heaviest strike. Across terraces, towers, Culverts and barns turned redoubts. Confirmations came back one after another, not loud, not dramatic, simply certain. Ready, North Terrace. Ready, Kettle Basin. Ready, Crown Ridge. Above them, in storm-dark orbit, Nexari reserve signatures began to bloom. Below them, the people Ray had called strategically irrelevant finished loading launchers, sealing mesh suits, and calibrating weather arrays for a night that would decide who governed Loamward when the sun came up. The first reserve signatures broke cloud shadow in the tight descending rings, Nexari hulls stacked by class and purpose, heavy cruisers above, kill platforms behind, shuttle screens below, all of it moving with the cold geometry of a species that believed mass and rank were the final argument. On Ridge 42, Colonel Elena Markovich watched the track settle on her display and keyed a theater-wide channel that rode fiber, mast light, and hand crank relay all at once. All Loamward commands, this is Colonial Defense Actual. Execute fallow net on Authority Code Markovich 7. Bait their vanguard through prepared dust corridors. Keep civilian lanes sealed and clear. Do not chase burning metal. Break command coherence first, then break mobility. Acknowledgements returned from every district in the same steady register she had heard since the first landings. North Terrace copies. Kettle Basin copies. Crown Ridge copies. Commander James Sullivan stood beside her under the shelter roof, rain ticking off corrugated steel. They still think the transit spine is the heart. Larson answered from the bunker channel, voice sharp and dry. Then, we will let them strike the wrong organ. By the third hour before dawn, Ray's reserve vanguard began its push over Harrow's western basins, driving low through the haze where suppressor fields should have opened clean lanes. Instead, they entered corridors preceded by Terran weather rigs and harvest drones with ferromagnetic chaff so fine it looked like ordinary dust, until every Nexari psychic amplifier started spitting noise. Formation timing slipped by fractions, then by full beats. Target handoffs lagged. Wing escorts overcorrected. On human boards, that drift appeared as widening windows. Markovich did not raise her voice. Window green. Tractor teams, pull. From culverts, loading depots, and 2 cargo yards the Nexari had flagged as non-combat infrastructure, Terran tractor tugs surged on pre-planned routes, armored with scavenged plating and towing kilometer spools of cargo rigging. Magnetic grapples snapped onto damaged cruiser flanks. Then heavy winches dug in and dragged those holes sideways, not toward destruction, toward geometry. Barn readout batteries hidden behind irrigation berms pivoted in sequence. Grain silos that had looked like passive storage telescoped open along scored seams, revealing mass driver throats nested inside insulated concrete. The first coordinated salvo crossed the valley in a flat silver line. One cruiser lost maneuvering and rolled hard, venting atmosphere in a slow spinning plume. A second took impacts along its sensor spine and went blind. A third tried to climb, clipped a shaft-thick storm layer, and drifted straight into the firing arc Sullivan had marked the night before on a paper map stained with machine oil. On the Nexari flagship, Prime Executor Sal fought his own display as data flooded in jagged and contradictory. Vanguard coherence below 40%. Psychic relays are desynchronizing across all forward elements. We need altitude separation and revectoring now. Ray remained standing at the command pit, gaze fixed forward. No withdrawal. Commit orbital kill platforms. Burn their batteries out. Sal hesitated for half a breath. If we deploy from this envelope, platform guidance will be vulnerable to atmospheric contamination. Ray's answer carried the same contempt he had shown in the council hall. Then, guidance will adapt faster than farmers. Kill platforms detached from reserve carriers and dropped through cloud in armored stacks, their guidance vanes glowing as they sought silo apertures, mast clusters, and relay sheds. For 11 seconds, the Nixari line looked restored. Then, Fallow Net went live. Across Harrow 9 and its neighboring moons, weather control towers fired synchronized bursts into the charged atmosphere, while decoy heat fields blossomed from empty terraces and abandoned tractor pools. Human kinetic teams released layered salvos from hidden rails, not aimed at platform hulls first, aimed at guidance seams and control fins already stressed by static. Signal paths fractured. 3 platforms slewed off course and slammed into prepared capture basins lined with dampening mesh and grav clamps. 2 more spiraled into high cloud and detonated harmlessly above the farms they were meant to erase. Sal stared at the telemetry and finally said what no Nexari operations room was built to say. "We have lost platform authority. Repeat, we have lost platform authority." Ray slammed one palm against the rail. "Ground all surviving units and transfer control through Flagship Direct. Direct paths are degraded. Then force them." On the ground, Captain Vesk received the same order in a storm of static, while his perimeter around Transit Strongpoint 3 collapsed lane by lane. Terran pollination swarms blinded optics. Converted suppressor pylons spat counter-emission bursts into Nexari channels. Every attempted push met shaped charges, then disciplined fire, then empty ground as human teams relocated before return bursts landed. Vesk tried to pull his cadres toward custody barge hard cover and found the route already cratered by his own disabled carrier. He opened command and spoke to whatever hierarchy still existed. "Strongpoint 3 can hold 10 minutes without armored relief. Maybe 12. There was no relief to send. Dawn approached as a dim whitening behind rain cloud, and with it came the final break. Harrow's eastern mass driver ring, silent for hours, fired in staggered cadence at Ray's command escorts while tractor teams pulled wrecked hulls into the flagship's emergency descent corridor. One escort disintegrated under crossfire. Another collided with debris and spun into lower atmosphere. The flagship took 2 glancing hits that overloaded its lateral field vanes. Then a concentrated EMP hail burst from 4 captured suppressor pylons reconfigured under phase Cedar. Its shield envelope guttered, flared, and died. Sal grabbed the command rail as alarms replaced speech. "Primary field failure. Helm response lagging. We cannot maintain orbit." Ray's jaw set so hard the muscles jumped. "Select landing zone. Harrow surface is hostile across all projected vectors. Select 1. The flagship came down ugly through storm and chaff, skidding across a fallow service plane between 2 water rights towers, tearing a trench through wet soil before slamming into a low berm and settling at a wounded angle. Around it, surviving Nexari shuttles tried to deploy defensive screens and found themselves bracketed by human fire from stone walls, culvert mouths, and warehouse roofs that had been range-marked for years. Markovich watched the crash plume rise on her forward feed and keyed all units. "Flagship grounded. Repeat, flagship grounded. Boarding Group A with me. Group B, secure perimeter and prisoner corridors. Medical teams staged forward. We end this clean." Sullivan caught her arm once as she passed. "Elena, he will try his mind on you at close range." She tapped the mesh collar at her throat. "Then he can learn new limits." The run to the wreck crossed mud, shredded plating, and steaming cable bundles. Terran boarders moved in 3 files under portable counter-emission rigs humming at their backs, each suit layered with mesh shielding that turned psychic pressure into static ache instead of command. Nexari defenders fired from breach points and were driven inward by stun lance bursts and concussive entries that wrecked doors without turning corridors into slaughterhouses. Markovich advanced through smoke-lit passageways that had once projected certainty and now flickered with emergency amber. On Deck 7 command access, they met Prime Executor Sal, trying to organize a last interior line. He took one look at the advancing Terran formation, at the counter-emission rigs nulling his cadre's advantage, and lowered his weapon. 2 of his officers followed. A third did not and was disarmed hard against a bulkhead, alive, cursing through broken translator output. Sal spoke first, voice unsteady but formal. High Commander remains on primary deck. He has ordered no surrender. Markovich kept her sidearm level. Then he is out of options and out of time. Bind them and move. They reached primary command through a warped blast door cut open with portable torches. Inside, Ray stood before a shattered tactical sphere, blood at the corner of his mouth, diadem sparking where one side had cracked in the crash. Encirclement feeds crawled on the wall behind him, each showing the same truth. Nexari strong points isolated, reserve elements burning, human units controlling every route that mattered. For one suspended moment, he looked less like a conqueror and more like a man refusing arithmetic. Then, he lifted both hands and drove a final psychic surge across the room. The counter-emission rigs answered in a hard, rising whine. Mesh shielding along the Terran line flared white. The surge struck, folded, and snapped back through Ray's damaged diadem in a pulse that dropped him to one knee with a strangled cry. Consoles around him blew out in showers of sparks. The tactical sphere went dark. Markovich stepped forward through the fading static, sidearm fixed on his chest. High Commander Ray, this theater is closed. Power down and stand. He coughed, spat red onto the deck, and looked up at her with an expression stripped of ceremony. For the first time since he had entered the council chamber, he seemed to be seeing humans as they were, rather than as a category in a model. His gaze flicked once to the dead screens, once to Sal in restraints behind the boarding line, once to the storm-lit hull breach where Harrow's gray morning showed through. When he spoke, the words were clear. I surrender unconditionally to Terran Command. No one cheered. Markovich gave a single nod to Sergeant Becker on her right. Record accepted on full chain. Secure the prisoner. Becker and another boarder moved in, locked Ray's arms, applied suppression cuffs, and checked him for cranial trauma as medical protocol required. He swayed once, nearly fell, and was caught before he hit the deck. A Terran medic knelt immediately, scanned his neural readings, and injected stabilizers to prevent seizure from the feedback burn. Ray glared at the needle, then at Markovich. You preserve me for spectacle. She held his gaze. For law. Outside the flagship, surrender cascaded in uneven waves as command authentication codes transmitted from Ray's captured deck. Some Nexari units dropped weapons at once. Others held until they saw orbital overlays confirming the reserve fleet's breakup and the loss of kill platform control. Captain Vesk surrendered at Strongpoint 3 after a final demand for casualty exchange and medical guarantees. He got both. Custody barges were secured intact. Conscripted labor crews were extracted under armed escort and moved to protected corridors Hayes had opened hours earlier, exactly as promised. By full morning light, Harrow 9's battlenet shifted from strike coordination to containment, triage, and evidence logging. Markovich stood beside the grounded flagship as rain thinned to mist, watching Ray transferred onto a shielded med sled under guard. Mud clung to everyone's boots. Smoke drifted over broken plating and trampled grain. In the near distance, a line of Terran volunteers was already reflagging one water tower and checking pump integrity. Sullivan arrived with Larson, both exhausted, both upright. He looked at the prisoner convoy and gave a tight, humorless exhale. Turns out peasants with weather control, mass drivers, and a filing system are difficult to pacify. Larson wiped rain from her brow and answered, without looking away from the fields. Put that in the tribunal brief, right after trespass. Markovich keyed command one final time for the phase close. All Loanward units, this is Colonial Defense. Confirm. High Commander Ray is in custody alive. Nexari Theater Command has surrendered unconditionally. Continue ceasefire enforcement, prisoner processing, and civilian corridor protection. Keep your records complete. Across terraces and moons, confirmations came back through battered relays and hand-crank sets that had outlived an Empire certainty. North Terrace confirms. Kettle Basin confirms. Crown Ridge confirms. Harrow's stormfront began to break and the first clean strip of sky opened above the same fields Ray had come to seize. Rainwater still ran in silver threads down the Nexari flagship hull when the first retaliation package arrived from Earth Defense Command. Target folders for 6 Nexari core habitats, each marked feasible under existing strike windows, each assembled by officers who had watched homestead footage on loop until their voices went flat. Colonel Elena Markovich read the packet in the Harrow command shelter while medics worked 20 meters away on both uniforms, human gray and Nexari black, and she passed it to Governor Ingrid Larson without comment. Larson scanned the casualty overlays, then looked through the doorway at the terraces where smoke drifted above flattened grain rows and said, "If we launch this, we can call it justice and still become what Ray said we were." Markovich keyed a secure line to Ambassador Sarah Hayes, who answered from a council-side chamber crowded with legal aides and exhausted observers. Hayes listened to the silence before the words, which told her more than the report itself. "Colonel," Hayes said, voice controlled and low, "are those folders operationally sound?" "Yes." "Are they necessary to end the threat?" "No." Nexari Theater Command is down, reserve fleet broken, surrender codes verified across all occupied moons. Hayes closed her eyes for one measured breath. "Then we do not strike civilian habitats. Not one. Issue standing fire denial on non-combatant zones and open protected corridors exactly as declared. I will carry the political cost." Markovich did not salute on audio, but something in her posture shifted into locked alignment. "Understood. Consequence without cruelty." Outside, a line of Terran volunteers in mud-streaked farm gear escorted disarmed Nexari personnel toward temporary holding lanes marked with reflective tape and multilingual signage. No one was shoved. No one was paraded. Captain Vesk walked with his wrists restrained and his jaw tight, expecting humiliation and getting procedure. At the processing tent, Sergeant Becker removed Vesk's damaged shoulder plate, handed it to an evidence clerk, and pointed him toward a medic station. Vesk stared at the treatment table as if it were a trick. "Your people lost homes because of us." Becker checked his restraint seal and answered in a tone used for inventory counts. "You are still a prisoner under law. Sit down before you fall down." By mid-afternoon, the Mercy decision became visible across the belt. Conscripted labor castes pulled from custody barges were moved through human-safe corridors under armed guard, then transferred to Valeri and Lum observer teams that had insisted on neutral chain verification. In one loading bay at Harrow Transit, a Nexari labor foreman with burn injuries refused water until his crew drank first. A Terran farm cooperative chair set down 6 canteens in a row and waited without speaking until the foreman nodded. Across the dock, captured kill platforms rested under tarp and grav clamps, while technical teams tagged every guidance fin, logging impact damage and contamination patterns for tribunal exhibits rather than trophy feeds. Physical evidence flowed with the same discipline as ammunition had the night before. Seizure beacons were collected, bagged, and cataloged by district and timestamp. Suppression control wafers removed during phase cedar were sealed in hard cases and signed through triple witness chain. Ray's cracked diadem, lifted from flagship command and still stuttering with residual charge, went into an insulated legal container with MedScan overlays attached. The original Nexari transition contracts, including the temporary occupants language, were printed in certified copy, cross-checked against translation logs, and entered as Exhibit Series 1. The hand crank receiver strips that had carried the reserve fleet intercept were flattened, scanned, and archived beside orbital telemetry from captured platforms. Nothing vanished into rumor. Nothing relied on memory alone. 3 days after Harrow, Hayes stood again in the council chamber beneath the restored star ceiling, with Ray present by secure hollow from tribunal custody, medically stabilized and restrained. Delegations that had watched his annexation speech now watched him hear charges read in full. Unlawful invasion, forced relocation orders, coercive suppression deployment against registered civilians, and attacks on protected civic infrastructure. When asked whether Terran Command sought capital punishment, Hayes answered before the legal clerk finished sitting down. Humanity does not petition for execution in this case. We petition for judgment, restitution, and enforceable dismantlement. The record matters more than spectacle. A murmur moved through the galleries, sharpest from worlds that had expected vengeance as policy. Hayes continued, each phrase weighted like treaty metal. You heard our warning before the first landings. You heard our corridor offer during the fighting. You now have verified logs that we honored both under fire. The distinction is deliberate. We defend our people without erasing yours. If this council wants stability rather than another cycle of prestige violence, then codify what Harrow proved. Food infrastructure is civic infrastructure, and civic infrastructure is sovereign. The callbacks arrived one by one. The 2 delegations that had asked whether Nexari force remained proportionate formally withdrew their support votes and entered censure motions. The Velari submitted corridor testimony confirming Terran treatment of surrendered units and rescued labor castes. The Scholars of Lum authenticated chain of custody on beacon logs and suppression wafers. Even the states that had hidden behind procedure voted for emergency inspections once the captured kill platform guidance cores were displayed with Nexari command signatures still intact. By the second week of adjudication, Prime Executor Sal gave deposition under oath and confirmed that Phase 1 had been authorized before council recess ended. Captain Vesk confirmed scorched road clearance had been requested and denied, a fact that stripped the last pretense that field excesses had been rogue improvisation. Ray spoke once at length, voice rough but still formal, attempting to frame the campaign as strategic necessity. The evidence did not bend. At a public hearing on Harrow 9, Larson stood beside a rebuilt water rights tower, while local families filled the benches and tribunal transmitters hovered in disciplined rows. Ray's sentence feed had just ended. Life confinement under interstellar war crime statute, no execution, no exchange, full access for historical record review. A farmer rose from the third row, hands still bandaged, and asked Larson the question everyone had carried. Why keep him alive after what he ordered? Larson looked at the repaired pump valves, then back at the crowd. Because dead men teach only fear. Living convictions teach boundaries. Our children need boundaries that outlast anger. The line held. By the 14th month, the last Nexari Coercive Institute was shuttered under multinational inspection, its archive stacks transferred to joint custody, with Loom scholars and Velari auditors present at every seal. In the council chamber, Under harsher lights and fewer illusions, the homestead sovereignty accords were ratified article by article. Agricultural worlds were recognized as protected civic military zones. Forced seizure of registered food infrastructure became a charter-level trigger for collective defense. Representation seats opened for former Nexari subject populations who had never before voted on policy that governed their lives. Hayes signed for Terra with a pen fashioned from reclaimed Harrow alloy, its barrel etched with district names raise maps had erased. Markovich, in full dress uniform this time, rather than mud-streaked armor, signed the military annex establishing corridor obligations and non-combatant protections as binding doctrine. Sullivan signed the logistics protocols that made distributed resilience a formal interspecies standard, instead of a Terran eccentricity. When the final seal set, the presiding bell rang once and no one mistook the sound for theater. The new order took shape in actions, not slogans. Joint patrols shifted from border intimidation to convoy security. Nexari heavy hulls were cut down under supervision, weapons arrays removed and remelted into orbital farm frame components. Former labor castes received transit grants, legal identity restoration, and guaranteed representation blocks in regional councils. Worlds that had backed annexation and then faced famine risk received Terran emergency food cultures anyway, with invoices marked humanitarian 0 because hunger had never respected voting history. On a clear morning in early planting season, Markovich returned to Harrow 9 out of uniform and stood with Larson and Sullivan at the edge of Terrace Delta 3. The stone irrigation walls, once scored by impacts, had been reset and mortared. Signal masts still stood on barn roofs, now painted in bright district colors instead of camouflage sealant. Children moved down the rows, dropping seed by hand where armored carriers had burned ruts months earlier, supervised by teachers, reservists, and 2 surrendered Nexari officers in restoration harnesses under watch. The officers worked in silence, lifting shattered culvert slabs and setting drainage pipe, according to plans drafted by the same cooperative they had tried to displace. Sullivan handed Markovich a small tablet, not tactical this time, just a yield forecast. We are ahead of pre-war projections on 3 valleys, behind on 2. Nothing we cannot fix. Larson watched one of the children wave impatiently at a Nexari officer who had set a marker stake crooked. The officer corrected it, checked the line twice, and stepped back. They came to seize land, she said. Now, they learn how much work it takes to keep it alive. Markovich looked across the terraces to the water tower, to the porch lights now used only for weather alerts and festival nights, to the fields that had never stopped being both home and fortress. For 2 centuries, she said quietly, echoing the warning that had started this war, we traded grain before guns and patience before pride. They finally chose to understand the price of refusing. No alarms sounded. No fleets crossed the cloud line. Wind moved through young wheat under a clean sky, and the people of Lomward kept planting.